Good evening, everyone. I'm Kathleen Miklas with the Friends of the Simsbury Public Library. I'd like to welcome you all tonight. I just want to point out on some of the chairs we have membership information. Please consider becoming a friend of the library. It helps us continue to bring great authors like Joseph Finder. Anyway.
Like Tinder.
Like Tinder. We are so thrilled to have him here tonight. Joe is a founding member of the International Thriller Writers. He's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Association of Former Intelligence Officers. His plan was to become a spy. I've been dying to say that all day. Or maybe a professor, of Russian history. Instead, he became a best-selling writer of 13 suspense. Also, Killer Instinct won the International Thriller Writers Award for Best Novel. Buried Secrets won the Strand Critics Award for Best Novel. And Company Man won the Barry Award for Best Thriller. Tonight he will discuss his standalone book, The Switch, which Kirkus Reviews has called a tense, uncannily relevant tale about government secrets falling into the wrong hands. Born in Chicago, Joe spent his early childhood living around the world, including Afghanistan and the Philippines. In fact, his first language before English was Farsi, which he spoke as a child in Kabul. Joe graduated summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa from Yale College, where he also sang with the school's legendary a cappella group, the Whiffin' Puffs. He received a master's degree from the Harvard Russian Research Center and later taught on the Harvard faculty. He was recruited to the CIA, but eventually decided he preferred writing fiction. Joe currently lives in Boston with his wife and their dog, Mia, a dropout from Seeing Eye Dog School. Please join me in welcoming Joe Finder.
Hi. It's great to be here. It's really especially great to be surrounded by people who read books, buy books, take them out of libraries. In the age of Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, it's really great to be around book people. So, plus some of you may have actually read my novels, which I don't take for granted. This reminds me, I'm on book tour right now for my new book, The Switch. I was on a book tour recently, and this is in Logan Airport in Boston. I got on the plane, and while I walked up the aisle, I noticed that there was a guy there reading one of my books in paperback. So I thought, do I say something? What do I do? It turned out I was sitting right behind him. So I sat there for a couple of minutes. I saw him reading the book. And finally, I kind of stuck my head in between the seats there, and I said, "Excuse me, how's that book?" And he said, So it gets a lot better after chapter 1, really. So I'll admit I have a strange resume for a writer of suspense fiction. As Kathleen mentioned, I planned to be a spy. I went to Yale, and that's where they recruited. The CIA loved to recruit from Yale, right? And I spoke Russian. I was a Russian studies major. I studied Russian history and Soviet politics, and I was recruited, and I decided to go to the Russian Research Center at Harvard instead. I was recruited again. Here's the problem. People always say to me, "Why did you not go into the CIA?" The problem was I was a big Robert Ludlum fan, okay? And I thought that when you worked for the CIA, they gave you, a Swiss bank account and a Glock and a lot of money, a lot of passports, and wrong. And it turned out that compared to the Bourne identity, the real life of a CIA officer is like being an accountant. Robert Ludlum basically ruined it for me. I decided it would be a lot more fun to write about it, you know. I wanted to write a novel, but I was actually afraid to. And nonfiction seemed easier. So I was in grad school one day, and I was at the dentist's, and I was reading People magazine, and they had an article about Dr. Armand Hammer. Remember who he was? It's been a while, but Dr. Armand Hammer, the CEO of Occidental Petroleum, friend of Lenin's. That's one thing you always heard about him. He was a friend of Lenin's. So Dr. Hammer, it said in the People magazine article, was a great philanthropist, and he had gone to Russia to help out the Russians in their time of need, in the time of famine, etc. Well, at the same time, I happened to be reading the letters of Lenin in Russian for one of my courses. Fascinating, let me tell you. The letters of Lenin in Russian, really. Real page turners. And in one of the letters, there was a letter from Lenin to Hammer, and it was addressed to Comrade Armand Hammer. And when a Soviet leader called you comrade, that meant you were a member of the Communist Party. But how could that be? Dr. Armand Hammer, this great capitalist and philanthropist, a member of the Communist Party, something strange was going on. So I did a little research, and it turned out that Armand Hammer's father, Julius Hammer, was a founder of the American Communist Party, along with John Reed. So I knew there had to be a story there. And I decided I wanted to write a book about Hammer and the other American businessmen who have close personal connections to the Kremlin. Does that sound familiar by any chance? Just saying. Anyway, I scored an interview with Hammer, and we were scheduled to talk for 2 hours for the book. And I got there, and about 15 minutes into my interview with him, I asked him about his father, Julius Hammer, the founder of the American Communist Party. And Hammer stood up and he said, "All right, that's it. The interview's over." And he kicked me out. So I realized I was onto something. I decided to go to Moscow, and in those days it was not easy to go to Moscow. I went as a tourist, but since I was fluent in Russian, I slipped away from the tour group to track down people who knew Armand Hammer from the old days. Armand Hammer lived with his family in Moscow in the 1920s for about 9 years. And one of the people I met in my research was a guy who told me he was Armand Hammer's KGB case officer. And I realized I had something really big. I got a call at my hotel room, and it was the KGB. And they said, "What are you doing here?" And I decided not to lie, and I said, "I'm doing some investigative journalism." And he said, "Moscow does not believe in investigative journalism. And I suggest you leave the country as soon as possible." And I did. While I was working on the book, I started getting calls from people who worked for Dr. Armand Hammer. And they would say things like, "Whatever you're getting into with the Armand Hammer's past and the Communist Party and the KGB and all that, let me give you a friendly suggestion," one guy said to me. "Don't mess with the doctor. He'll sue the socks off of you." Now, I was living in Cambridge, Mass. In Central Square, paying $245 a month in rent. So basically, I didn't have any socks to sue out of, okay? Hammer decided he wanted to try to kill this book one way or the other. He called my advisor at Harvard, my mentor, and told him that if they would kick Joe Finder out of the program, kill off this book, he would give Harvard his papers and $25 million. And this may be the first time in Harvard's history they ever said no to money But they did. So, in fact, the day that my book was published, an op-ed piece appeared in the New York Times op-ed page written by Louis Nizer. Does anyone remember that name, Louis Nizer? He was, in addition to being a well-known attorney, he was Arm & Hammer's lawyer. And the piece said, basically, there was a new book out and it libels one of my clients. But under the public figure exception, he can't sue for libel. But it's time to change the libel laws. And so I read this and I just went, oh my God. Well, as it turned out, they didn't sue me for libel. And why would they? That would involve discovery. They wouldn't want to go through that process. Instead, what Hammer did was he had his people around the country buy up as many copies of the book as they could to get it off the market. So get this, it sold really well. This is what they call a clean sell-through in publishing, right? So you have to understand, I was thinking to myself, you're afraid to be a novelist? You just almost got arrested by the KGB. You got threatened with a libel suit. You're afraid to be a novelist? Hello? Well, I decided I wanted to write a novel based on what I couldn't say in my nonfiction book. I gave myself a deadline. I said 3 years to write and sell it. If you sell the book within 3 years and you make enough money to support a family, do it. Otherwise, quit. So what I did was I read every great thriller I could get my hands on. Everything from John le Carré to Graham Greene to Eric Ambler, Ken Follett, Frederick Forsyth, Robert Ludlum, of course. I made notes on what worked and what didn't work. And this was like my own little graduate school in writing thrillers. And the concept of my first novel, called The Moscow Club, was there was a backstory about a character based on Arm & Hammer. But the story was really about a coup in the Kremlin against Gorbachev. And in the book, I actually named the people who were pulling off this coup against Gorbachev. So the book came out in February of '91, and the first review, I think it was the New York Times, talked about how far-fetched the plot was. 6 months later, I was awakened early in the morning from a phone call from one of my sources in the CIA, who said, "You watching CNN?" I said, "No, what?" He said, "Check it out." And I turned on the TV, and there were tanks going through the streets of Moscow, and Gorbachev was under house arrest. There was basically a coup in the Kremlin against Gorbachev, and the people that I named in my book were the people who were involved in that coup. And the guy said to me, "Someone in Moscow read your book." That's all we can figure. So, one question I get asked more than any other is there going to be a movie? Now, I've actually had 2 movies made, one good and one bad. High Crimes and Paranoia. I'm going to talk about High Crimes and not talk about Paranoia. So I got a call from my agent saying that he was pretty sure this movie was going to be green-lit. They had a director. Ashley Judd was interested. Morgan Freeman wanted to play the role. And I said to my agent, "So, all right, I want a cameo. Can I have a cameo?" And the agent said, "It's not really that simple." And I said, "Alfred Hitchcock always got cameos." He said, "Joe, there's a difference between you and Hitchcock. Apart from about 300 pounds. Hitchcock was the director. And you, Joe, are the writer. And the writer in Hollywood, in the totem pole, is below ground, right? That's just the way it works." So anyway, I said, "Well, still, tell the director that I want to have a cameo appearance in this, if possible." I got a call a few weeks later from my agent who said, "All right, Joe, good news and bad news." What's the good news? Good news is you've been invited to play a role, you've been invited to play a cameo part in High Crimes. You'll be in the jury. It's a small part, but what do you want? And I said, what's the bad news? And he said, you're going to have to shave your head. You're playing a Marine JAG officer. And I said, fine, I'll do it myself. I'll go to Great Cuts myself and shave my head. No. You have to have the makeup people do it on set. So they flew me out to Hollywood. And I talked to the director, and the director wanted to make a deal with me. He said he wanted me to go incognito. He did not want anyone on the set to know who I was. Why? Because he figured if they knew that the author of the book was there, all the actors would be going up to me and saying, excuse me, Joe, this line, does it seem right to you? Shouldn't it be longer, right? So I agreed I would go incognito. And after we talked for a few minutes, the director said, say, you know, you've got a certain authority. And I said, yes, I do. And he said, let's promote this guy. So on the spot, they promoted me from being a member of the jury to being a JAG officer. I was supposed to be a member of the jury, which meant when the camera panned over the jury box, you know, they'd probably skip me. Or that part would be cut out. That's what always happens, right? But if I'm going to be a JAG officer, that meant I was in 5 scenes, which meant that I had to work for 5 days. Work, I love that. I had to work for 5 days as an actor for 5 scenes. And my job was basically to glare at Morgan Freeman. They gave me no lessons, I just worked on my glare. And at one point, my character beats Morgan Freeman up. But I didn't get to do it, they had someone else do it. Now, so I sat down there, and the guy who played the prosecutor turned to me and he said, how you doing? My name's Mike. And I said, hi, Mike, I'm Joe. And he said, so, Joe, where are you from? I said, Boston. He said, they flew you in from Boston for this part? I said, yeah. He said, do you know somebody or something? No. So he said, all right, Joe, look, if you really want to understand your part, you need to understand what this movie is really all about. And I've read the book. And so what it really is all about, it's really all about, and he began to explain in great depth what this movie was really all about, and what the book was all about, and what the thematic underpinnings were and everything. And I sat there listening to him, and he was actually pretty good. And I said, all right, Mike, listen, I got to tell you, my name is Joseph Finder. I wrote the book the movie's based on. And he went, oh, man, Ashley Morgan, this guy wrote High Crimes. Blew my cover. Now, you have to imagine, I was sitting there in a courtroom that was based entirely on my book. It was exactly the way I described it. So I was sitting on a set that several years earlier I had made up in my own head, just me sitting at my computer. How weird is that to be surrounded by 100 people working on this project that basically I was able to do myself. It's kind of, it's very cool. Basically, 500 people are involved in making a movie, 500 people making the movie of something that I wrote by myself, sitting alone in a room at a computer. I acted in 5 scenes, 5 days. There's a rule in Hollywood that if you work for 3 days on a movie or more, that you have to join SAG, the Screen Actors Guild. So I got paid $1,000 for 5 days of acting, $200 a day. And I had to join SAG, which cost $1,500. I decided at one point I really wanted to meet Morgan Freeman. How cool is that guy? He's really the best. So during a break, I ignored what the director said to me, and I went up to him, and he was standing there with this the guy who plays his stand-in, his body double, who's a guy who's about the same height as him, the same complexion, the same kind of hair. And anyway, I said, "Excuse me, Mr. Freeman, I just wanted to say hi. My name is Joe Finder. I wrote the book High Crimes." And Freeman turned to the guy he was talking to and said, "So this gentleman here says he wrote the book High Crimes like I'd give a..." And the blood rushed to my head. And I thought, Morgan Freeman? The nicest guy in Hollywood? And I said, "Excuse me for daring to interrupt the movie star." And he went, "Ha ha, I got you, didn't I?" Yeah, not so funny. Anyway, I want to tell you a little bit about The Switch because I need to make you buy the book, all right? And if I don't talk about it, you're not going to want to buy the book. Now, I go on book tour every year. On one of my tours, I went through an airport security line. I took off my shoes and my belt and took my laptop out and put it in the plastic tray and everything. And on the other side of the X-ray machine, I pulled out my laptop, and it turned out it wasn't my laptop. It was someone else's laptop. It looked identical. So I figured that out, and I put it back down, and I thought to myself, man, what would have happened if I had taken the wrong laptop? Well, in reality, not that much. It would have been a hassle, right? But then the thriller writer's brain in me started cranking up. And I thought, what if there were something on this laptop, let's say classified information? And let's say this laptop belonged to someone important, like, a female U.S. senator who is careless with classified information. Just a thought. So that's where the idea for The Switch came from. What I'd like to do is I'd like to read a scene from it and then take whatever questions you may have. I need to set this scene up for you first. The hero of the book is a guy named Michael Tanner. He has a coffee business in Boston. He imports beans and roasts them and sells them. And in the middle of the night, bad things have been happening to him. In the middle of the night, he gets a call telling him that his coffee company, that there's a fire in his coffee company. And he's got to get out there right away. Tanner felt the first droplets of rain, a faint drizzle, as he was getting into his car on Comm Ave. The asphalt pavement gleamed under the yellowish sodium light, speckling with water. His stomach clenched at the thought of Tanner roast being ravaged, maybe destroyed. He wondered if the rain might help slow down or extinguish the fire, and he hoped the rain increased. Suddenly he wondered, was it possible someone had set off a fire in order to provide a cover for a break-in at the warehouse? Or was that just paranoid thinking? He found himself driving faster and faster, and when he realized he was going over 80, he took his foot off the accelerator. The last thing he needed was to be pulled over for a speeding ticket while his entire business, his investment, and yes, his nest egg, went up in flames and smoke and ash. On the right was a chain-link fence, and then the tracks of the T, the Boston subway system, which ran above ground in some places. On the left was the block-long, red brick building that housed the offices of an old-time safe and lock company. And then came 50 Mayfield Street, where Tanner Roast was located. And just up ahead, maybe half a block away, some guy was waving him down. A big man in a soiled, sleeveless T-shirt, a so-called wife-beater. Bald but shiny bald, and a goatee dyed black. On his neck and every exposed inch of his arms were tats, like he was a walking ad for a tattoo shop. He wasn't old, he wasn't young, he just looked powerful and all business. He continued to wave with his left hand, wave him over to the side of the street, and then his right hand came up. In it was an immense black weapon, a veritable hand cannon. Tanner knew nothing about guns or calibers, but he knew it was a semi-automatic pistol, and it was huge. The man locked eyes with Tanner. They were the basilisk eyes of someone used to getting his way. It was the look of an apex predator ready to pounce. The man was going to kill him. And in a sudden cascade of knowledge, all became clear to Tanner. There's no fire. No fire trucks racing through the streets. No smoke. No flashing lights. No traffic blockades. Just this one guy with a gun. And so there, I would like to stop. You got to buy the book now, right? You have to know what happens. It gets worse. I would like to take any questions you may have. And who would like to be the first? It's always got to be a first. Yes, ma'am.
Hi.
Hi.
I love coffee. And there was, every time I would read and there'd be something about coffee mentioned, I'd be going for coffee. How did you do all your research? How did you...
I drank a lot of coffee. There is a guy in Boston named George Howell who has a coffee company called the George Howell Coffee Company, which roasts some of the finest coffee in the country. He founded a company before George Howell Coffee Company called The Coffee Connection, which had a number of stores in Boston and around Boston. He eventually sold it to Starbucks. And one of the things he did was to invent the Frappuccino. So I spent time with George Howell talking about his business and what it was like to run a coffee company. And I absorbed as much as I could because I love coffee too. And that's one of the great advantages of doing research is you get to ask people questions that you might not ordinarily get to ask. Yes, sir.
Getting back to Arm & Hammer, you said that his friends bought up all the books that were out there that you've written. Are there any out there now that are available?
Yeah, after he died, some warehouse opened up and copies went on the market. They're kind of expensive. You can get them through abebooks.com. They're hard to find. You can find paperbacks easily, but it's hard to find the hardcover. Yes?
Hi, I'm a big fan of yours. I've read
Thank you.
all of your all of your fiction.
Yeah.
And I love it.
Thank you.
What was your first published book of fiction, and how difficult was it for you to get it published? Well, first of all, you probably had to get an agent first.
Yes, exactly. So you know something about the process, right?
Very little.
Okay.
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, I'll repeat the question. Thank you. So she wants to know what it was like, what the process was to get published for the first time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, as I said, I gave myself 3 years, and I wrote a draft of a novel, and I sent it to an agent I'd met on the beach, actually, in Truro, who I knew he represented, a number of, Judith Krantz, remember her? Yeah. Anyway, represented some big commercial authors. Sidney Sheldon, that's it, and Sidney Sheldon, right. And I sent it to him, and he sent it back, and the note said, sorry, not for me. And I called him up, which he did not expect. And I said, I don't want to argue, I just want to know why you didn't like the book. And he told me, we talked for about an hour, he told me what was wrong with the book, which was great and very generous of him. And I rewrote it, and I sent it to him again later, a few months later, and he sent it back. And I called him up again, and we talked some more, and he told me what I was doing wrong, which I learned from. And then I rewrote it, and then he said to me, don't send it to me again. So I didn't send it to him again, but I sent it to this big agent who represented Tom Clancy. And the manuscript was like 900 pages long. It was way too long. And he sent it back, and there was a paper clip. And the note that was attached to it said that I stopped reading on page 55. If you haven't grabbed the reader by then, you're not going to sell this book. So I sent the exact same manuscript to an agent who represented Robert Ludlum. And he called me up a few days later and he said, if you'd be willing to cut out the first 60 to 80 pages, I would be happy to represent you. So I realized that's the kind of agent you want to have, someone who actually reads the book and knows how to edit it and get it in shape for sending out. So once I had that, I was able to make a sale in the UK and in the US for enough money that I quit my job teaching at Harvard, and I haven't had a real job ever since. Sir?
Are you under contract with Random or Penguin?
Penguin. Yes.
To write a book a year or 2 years?
A book a year. Right. I have a 3-book deal with them. This is my second 3-book deal I'm on right now. I'm published by Dutton, which is an imprint of Penguin. And I like them a lot. They seem to like me. Yes, ma'am.
In your writing process, which comes first, the development of the plot? Then do you build the characters, or do you do the characters and then develop the plot around the characters?
So she asks, which came first? Which comes first, the development of the plot or the characters? It's a very good question, and it's different for different writers. For me, it's the concept. It's the what if. And I begin to think about, I start with a what if concept. What if a regular business guy is going through the airport and picks up the wrong laptop and the laptop belongs to somebody? And I begin to brainstorm the concept. But at the same time as I'm brainstorming ideas around the plot, I begin to think of the character and what kind of person it would have to be. So the character and the development of the plot sort of happen around the same time. Yes?
To go back to the Arm & Hammer after you got the book written and published, did you have more threats against you?
After the book was published?
Yeah.
No, not after the book was published. I had the threats while I was writing it because they were trying to get me to give up. They were trying to discourage me from writing the book. After it was published, there were threats of libel, but I knew he wasn't going to do anything. And in fact, I was young when I wrote this book. I was 23. And, you know, if I had known then what I know now, I would have called the New York Times and told them that this guy was trying to threaten me and trying to sue me for libel. Right? That would have been great publicity for the book. But then again, we couldn't have sold any more copies because my publisher was threatened by them, and my publisher decided to print no more copies after they sold out the print run. Yes?
Are any of your sources reluctant to talk to you?
Are any of my sources reluctant to talk to me? Sure, at the beginning. Usually it'll take some time, but what I find is that most people like to talk about what they do. I have sources right now in the intelligence community that I've had for years. And if I need someone in a specially particularized area of intelligence, usually a friend of mine will recommend me to someone else. The thing is that I've learned this important lesson that it's easier to get people to talk to you if you're writing fiction than if you're writing nonfiction. Because if you're writing nonfiction, if I were a reporter for the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, they don't want to talk to me, these CIA guys. But knowing I write fiction, it's not a problem for them. So generally, they're not too reluctant. Yes?
Do you begin with an outline, or do you just begin writing the story and have it go?
So she asked, do I begin with an outline or I just start writing the story? I've done it both ways. I got into an argument with my friend Lee Child about this. Lee Child does no outline at all. He just starts writing. Every day he discovers something new, no outline. I tried that, and I wasted 3 months writing scenes that would never make it into the final book. So what and I've also done something different. I talked with Robert Ludlum about this, and he suggested that I do a very detailed outline. And he would do outlines of around 150 typed pages, single-spaced, really serious outlines. And I did that for one of my books. And by the time I sat down to write the book, I was so bored. I mean, I couldn't do it. I felt like I was a factory worker, just doing exactly what I was assigned to do. So what I do instead is I do what in Hollywood they call a beat sheet. I'll have the basic beats of the story outlined so that every day I sit down to write, I don't know how I'm going to get from G to H or H to I, but I have to figure it out while I do the writing. And that means that I'm open to changing my mind. And in fact, if any of you have read my book Paranoia, you know that I like twist endings. And that one I didn't outline. I could not have outlined. I actually thought of it halfway through writing the book. I had this light bulb went on over my head. I had this idea for how to end Paranoia that was completely different from what I had started out doing. And it's those kinds of discoveries that make it more exciting for me and for the reader, I'm convinced. Way back there.
Did you like writing as a kid?
Did I like writing as a kid? I sure did. In fact, I'll tell you a quick story about how I became a writer and why. And this is something that I wrote about for Publishers Weekly magazine a couple weeks ago. When I was 8 years old, I used to hang out at the Albany Public Library in the children's room, and I discovered a novel called The Wonderful Flight to the Mushroom Planet by a writer named Eleanor Cameron. And I loved this book, and I turned all my friends onto it. And then there were 2 other books in the series, and we all read the book. And everyone in the 3rd grade was reading the Mushroom Planet books. And I decided I wanted to write a letter to Eleanor Cameron. So I wrote her a letter, and in those days, it's not like today, you know, when you can, if you want to write to an author, you go to his website or her website, and you click, and you could hear back from the author that day or the next day. In those days, writing a letter to the author was like putting a letter in a message in a bottle and throwing it into the ocean. You never knew what was going to happen. So I got an answer about a month later, and it was a form letter. And I was a little disappointed, but I noticed on the envelope Eleanor Cameron's return address. So I wrote to her directly, typing, you know, one finger on my mom's typewriter. So you didn't answer my questions. Was David in the book based on your son, David? And blah, 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 blah. And she wrote back within the week a full, one whole page, single space typed. And I wrote right back to her. Poor Eleanor Cameron did not know what she'd gotten into. And I wrote right back to her, and she wrote back to me. And this went on for 3 years.
Oh my goodness.
And this was my realization that behind every novel was a human being making all these narrative decisions. And how exciting could that be? And I decided that's what I wanted to do when I grew up. Yes, question.
Have you been inspired to write anything new given current events?
Have I been inspired to write anything new given current events? You know something? You know the expression, you can't make this up? Well, the thing is, you can make it up, because that's what I do. I make it up. But it's too weird what's going on today. So if I'm going to write something, it's got to be even stranger than what's really going on, which I can't imagine what that is. Yes?
Do you experience writer's block, and when that happens, what do you do about it?
I do, but I don't call it writer's block. My feeling is that plumbers don't get plumber's block. They don't sort of say, oh, I'm not inspired to plumb today. Oh, if only the gods of plumbing. No. So instead, what I've realized is that when I can't write for some reason, there's a good reason for it. It may be that I haven't figured out the scene, or it may be that I need to just go for a walk, or I need to do some more research. I need to call one of my sources or something like that. But basically, I treat writer's block as a diagnostic thing, and I sort of determine there's got to be a fix to this. Because otherwise, you can't do a book a year if you're going to give in to writer's block. You had a question.
I understand that you're working on your next book already. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Well, I never do that, and you know I never do that. I do not talk about the books that I'm working on. All I will say is that it has a female protagonist, and it takes place in Boston. Yes.
Who do you admire most as an author? One question. Second question, are there so much now with technology, kids are just into their iPhones and their iPads. Do you see young writers coming up and, I mean, as the new crop of writers?
Yeah, so she asked, who do I admire as a writer? And what about younger people? Are there younger writers? There are some really good younger writers coming up. Everybody is affected by movies and television. I mean, we all are. So our attention spans are shorter because of the internet, in fact, one of the reasons. So I find that younger people don't seem to be reading books as much. They're online all the time. They're on Facebook or Instagram or whatever. I don't know if that's going to change. I worry about that because as you all know, there is nothing like the pleasure of reading a novel, of basically having your head do the casting and the directing and the whole thing, right? It's a powerful experience. But there are some really good younger authors, and I've blurbed them, so I'm not worried about them. Who do I admire? It's a real range. Everyone from Nelson DeMille to Ken Follett to Frederick Forsyth, Robert Ludlum, Harlan Coben, Lee Child, and then in the more literary end of things, John le Carré is, I think, the greatest spy novelist there is. So there are a lot of really good writers out there. And the problem is when I'm writing my books, I can't read someone else's fiction. It gets in my head. Way back there, Kathleen.
Can you tell us a little bit about your childhood and how you ended up living in Afghanistan?
Well, she asked about my childhood and how I ended up in the Philippines and Afghanistan. My father was a Fulbright scholar. He wasn't a spy. He was a Fulbright scholar. And his job was to set up centers for teaching English as a second language. And so they did that in the Philippines and then moved to Afghanistan, and that's where I learned Farsi because my parents were gone during the day and I was raised by their servants who were Afghans who spoke to me in Farsi. And my brother and sister were born there in Kabul at home. So it was a very strange way to live. And Afghanistan was a beautiful place back then. It's really a shame. So that's sort of how we ended up traveling around the world. Other questions? Sir?
You spoke about High Crimes as a movie.
Yeah.
And glossed over the fact that Paranoia was...
Sucked?
I didn't say that.
You're kind of trying to make me talk about Paranoia?
What didn't you like about it? What worked about it?
First of all, you probably haven't seen Paranoia, most of you. Some of you have, right? Did you like it?
No.
I mean, it's not the book, right? I don't mind if a movie veers away from the book. If you've read High Crimes and seen the movie, you know they made some changes, a number of major changes. That's okay. I don't have a problem with that. The cast for Paranoia was fantastic. Harrison Ford, and then Gary Oldman. These are two great actors. Richard Dreyfuss was in it too. The guy who played Adam, Liam Hemsworth, is really good. So the cast was terrific. The problem was that the producer had her own vision of what was going to sell this movie, and she needed to appeal to young people, she thought. And she wanted to make it kind of a date movie. And therefore, they tried to sex it up, basically, and it didn't work. And they didn't understand some basic concepts about the book that made the book work. So, you know, I signed a contract saying I wouldn't talk about it publicly. And you made me do it. What can I say? I mean, the book's always better. In the green, sir.
Did you write the screenplay?
For Paranoia? The movie that sucked? No, I didn't write the screenplay for either one. They didn't ask me to. I wrote a screenplay for one of my books, Killer Instinct. And so that's in development right now. Development is Hollywood's term for nothing's happening, right? But I did not write the screenplay for it. Their feeling is they're afraid to ask the author to write the screenplay. They think the author is going to be unwilling to give up, you know, his favorite scenes or characters or whatever it is. And the fact is, when you take a 400-page book and you boil it down to a 110-page double-spaced screenplay, you're going to lose a lot. So, and I know that. But they didn't ask me to do it. I'm kind of glad I didn't. All the way in the back. Did the FBI ever take this further? Did that investigation get carried any further? No, it didn't, because presumably that's beyond the statute of limitations. And he denied it. And at first it came down to my word versus his. But then after the Soviet Empire dissolved and the Comintern records opened up, the proof came out. So it was too late, I think. It was too late to do anything about it. But there were people in the CIA who told me that they knew that he had been working for the KGB. Yes?
What is your favorite book that you've written?
Of mine? That's like asking you to choose your favorite child. Do you know I only have one child? I do, so she's my favorite. I really liked Paranoia, because Paranoia was for me the first time that I wrote in this kind of, I wrote with a sense of, my agent before that had told me that humor did not belong in novels of suspense. And he made me cut out all humor. In Paranoia, I got a new agent. Paranoia, I put it back in. And I realized humor works great with suspense. It's a great way to counterplay with suspense. So Paranoia was the first time that I did that, and I felt liberated. So I guess for that reason, Paranoia. I love The Switch, honestly. I don't love all my books, but I really loved the book and I loved writing it, which I don't always do either. It was just fun to write. Yeah.
Hi, again. What is your writing schedule? Do you write every day, 7 days a week, or do you have a block of time every day, or what?
Do I write 7 days a week? I do. I work 7 days a week on my books. I can't write every day. I mean, for example, right now I'm doing research on my new book and plotting, and I'm not ready to do a lot of the writing yet. But so I'll work on it every day, and the plotting, 7 days a week. When I'm writing, and it's really flowing, I'll write several thousand words a day, and I'll work 7 days a week doing that. And that means the book gets done in about 3 months, once I start writing.
When you say 7 days a week, I mean, you're not writing 24/7.
No, no. So I usually work in the morning. The afternoon, I will take some time off. Usually late afternoon, I get a second wind. Yes?
Do you ever have a say as to who narrates your books, and do you listen to your audiobooks?
Do I have a say as to who narrates my books, and do I listen to my audiobooks? I do have a say. They usually send me 5 or 6 audio tapes, demos, auditions, and I listen to them. And so I picked out a guy named Steve Carney to do who I think is really good. But I don't really listen to my audiobooks because it's how do I describe this? It feels like someone else's story when it's my story. I hear my voice in my head. To hear someone else saying it is weird. I mean, I love audiobooks, and in fact, on the way down here, I'm listening to an audiobook, and I love that. But I can't listen to my own books on audio. It's just too weird for me. Yeah.
Not to put you on the spot too much, but what is your take on the whole Russian meddling in our elections and what's going on?
I'll tell you if you want. I have some theories. I believe, first of all, 2 things. I don't think they're going to prove collusion, and I don't think that Trump is going to be impeached. I think that we're going to get 4 or perhaps even 8 years if there are no Democrats of Trump. That's one thing. I believe that Trump made deals with some of the Russian oligarchs and laundered money for them when he needed money badly. And I think they might be able to prove that. As for whether there was a collusion, if there was a deal, I'm pretty sure that Paul Manafort would have made some sort of deal with the Russians to publicize John Podesta's emails at the right time. Because the Russians like to make deals. Once they do, they have you on the hook. So it's the weirdest situation. So I believe there was collusion, but I don't think they're going to be able to prove it. That's my short answer. Sir?
Well, how long have you either lived or been connected to Boston? And do any of your characters come out of people you've met?
I've lived in Boston for 30 years. And I consider myself a Bostonian now, all except for the fact that I don't have an accent. I wish I did, but I don't. And the characters are all based on people I know there. My characters are always based on people that I know one way or another. But Boston is full of great characters. So it provides great material for me.
That's going to be my question. You got the coffee roaster, you got the senator, the aide. Is that someone you knew or liked?
Yeah. So the guy. So I did not tell the story from the point of view of the senator, but from the her chief of staff. So I went to Washington and I interviewed 6 different chiefs of staff and hung out with them, chiefs of staff to U.S. senators, which is really an interesting job. It's very high pressure. It burns you out young, and you have to make sure that you're never in front of the senator, that you're in the background as much as possible. So it's a difficult job, but I got some great scenes out of it, which I used for Will Abbott in The Switch. Someone over there? Was there someone? One last question before we go? Oh yes, go ahead.
Are you planning on writing a book on how to write?
If you go to my website, there's a whole section for writers. I've published a number of things about how to write for Writer's Digest magazine, Writer magazine. I'm probably not going to write a book. I sort of feel people who write books on how to write usually are people who are not making a living at it. Hate to say it. So since I'm doing okay, since I'm making a living at it, I don't want to write a book about how to do it. I don't want to tell anyone else. All right, one last question. My favorite recreational things to do in Boston. Does going out to eat count? There are so many great restaurants in Boston. We live on Comm Ave. I love walking down the mall to the Boston Public Garden, which is one of the most beautiful parks in the world. I love walking around Newbury Street and shopping. I have friends who have taken the duck boat tours and really love those. I've never done it, but it's an interesting tour, right? Yeah. I will not bicycle around Boston, though. It's dangerous. I mean, I have a great bike and I love bicycling, but not around Boston. Exactly. And by the way, I am now a Massachusetts driver. So watch out. Anyway, thank you so much.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.